minds confronted the same terrifying diagnosis in the 19th century. Western civilization was collapsing inward, losing the foundations that once gave human existence meaning. Fyodor Dostoevsky and Friedrich Nietzsche saw what their contemporaries refused to acknowledge. The old certainties were dying, and humanity would soon face the void. Both thinkers understood that rationalism alone could not sustain the human soul. Science and Enlightenment progress had promised to replace religion with reason. But reason cannot answer the fundamental question of why one should continue living. Neither discovered a comfortable solution, yet each proposed radically different paths forward. Nietzsche called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. This statement carries enormous weight from a thinker who dismissed most philosophers as confused. Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky's work in a Nice bookshop during the winter of 1886. The encounter transformed his final productive years before his mental collapse in 1889. What drew these minds together was their shared recognition of a spiritual emergency. What separated them was everything that followed from that recognition. Dostoevsky believed humanity could only be saved through suffering, love, and return to Christ. Nietzsche believed humanity must create new values through self-overcoming and affirmation of life. This is not merely a debate between religion and atheism. Both thinkers went deeper than that shallow distinction allows. They were asking, what is a human being capable of becoming? Their opposing answers still define the fundamental choices we face today. Understanding this confrontation requires grasping what each thinker actually believed, not caricatures. Dostoevsky was not simply defending traditional Christianity against modern criticism. Nietzsche was not simply attacking morality to celebrate cruelty. Both were engaged in rigorous psychological and philosophical analysis of the human condition. This exploration will move through their core arguments, underlying assumptions, and historical contexts. We will examine how their ideas connect to neuroscience, psychology, economics, and social theory. Not to force artificial connections, but to show where genuine intersections illuminate deeper truths. The goal is understanding, not comfortable simplification. Part 1. The crisis they diagnosed. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche confronted nihilism, the belief that existence lacks inherent meaning or value. This was not an abstract philosophical puzzle for either thinker. Nihilism was the spiritual sickness they saw spreading through European civilization. Understanding their diagnosis requires grasping what they meant by this term. Nietzsche announced the death of God in The Gay Science, published in 1882. This phrase does not mean God literally died or that Nietzsche personally killed religious belief. It means the conceptual framework that sustained Western values for 2 millennia had collapsed. The cultural belief in a divine source of meaning and morality could no longer be taken seriously. Science had not disproven God in any simple, logical sense. Rather, the scientific worldview made supernatural explanations feel increasingly implausible to educated Europeans. But Nietzsche saw that this created an enormous problem most people refused to confront. The entire moral structure of Western civilization depended on metaphysical assumptions now dissolving. Consider what the Christian worldview provided: an explanation for suffering, a purpose for existence, moral absolutes. It told people their lives mattered in an eternal cosmic drama. Remove this framework, and you do not simply lose religion. You lose the psychological foundation that allowed people to bear life's hardships. Dostoevsky understood this crisis from a different angle, but reached remarkably similar conclusions. He had lived among Russian intellectuals who eagerly imported Western materialism and utopian socialism. He watched young radicals embrace ideologies that denied the soul and reduced humans to matter. His novels dramatize what happens when people actually try to live without transcendent meaning. The character Ivan Karamazov articulates the logical endpoint of atheism with brutal clarity. If there is no God, everything is permitted. This does not mean atheists necessarily become murderers. It means no rational ground exists for preferring compassion over cruelty. Morality without God becomes mere preference, social convention, or biological instinct. You might personally dislike murder, but you cannot call it objectively wrong. Your disgust carries no more metaphysical weight than your preference for chocolate over vanilla. This is the abyss both thinkers stared into with unflinching honesty. The Underground Man, Dostoevsky's nameless narrator from Notes from Underground, embodies this crisis directly. Published in 1864, this short novel influenced Nietzsche profoundly when he encountered it. The underground man is hyperconscious, educated, and utterly paralyzed. He knows that the rational materialist worldview cannot satisfy human spiritual needs. The underground man attacks the utilitarian progressives who believe they can engineer human happiness. These reformers assume humans are rational beings who want comfort, security, and prosperity. Build the right social system, they claim, and human suffering will end. The underground man recognizes this vision ignores something fundamental about human nature. Humans do not simply want rational satisfaction of needs. They want to assert their will, to prove they are not merely parts of a machine. A person might deliberately act against their own interest just to prove they are free. The capacity for irrational choice is precisely what makes humans different from ants in a colony. This insight connects directly to contemporary neuroscience and behavioral economics. Research consistently shows humans do not act as rational utility maximizers. We make decisions based on emotion, identity, social belonging, and narrative meaning. A purely economic model of human motivation misses most of what actually drives behavior. The underground man suffers from what Nietzsche would later call ressentiment, a French term he kept untranslated. Ressentiment is not ordinary resentment, but a poisonous psychological condition. It develops when a person feels powerless to act against those they perceive as superior. Unable to discharge their hostility outward, they turn it inward and transform it into moral judgment. The person consumed by ressentiment cannot simply hate their enemy. They must convince themselves that their powerlessness is actually virtue. Weakness becomes humility. Inability to fight becomes pacifism. Envy becomes righteous indignation. The entire value system gets inverted to make the weak appear morally superior to the strong. Nietzsche believed this psychological mechanism explained the historical triumph of Christianity. The slaves of the ancient world could not defeat their Roman masters through force. Instead, they achieved victory through a moral revolution that redefined the meaning of good and evil. Strength, pride, and excellence became sins, while meekness, poverty, and suffering became virtues. Dostoevsky saw the same psychology at work, but interpreted it very differently. His underground man is sick precisely because he lacks genuine faith. The resentment that poisons him could be cured through authentic Christian love and humility. The problem is not Christianity itself, but the failure to actually live its teachings. Both thinkers agreed that the modern world had produced unprecedented psychological suffering. The old gods were dying, but nothing adequate had emerged to replace them. Secular ideologies offered material progress without addressing the soul's hunger for meaning. Nationalism, socialism, and scientism all failed to provide what religion once gave. This diagnosis receives support from contemporary psychology and sociology. Rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide have risen dramatically in wealthy secular societies. Material prosperity does not automatically produce psychological well-being or sense of purpose. The data suggest both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche identified something real about human needs. Dostoevsky's biographical experience gave him unique insight into these questions. In 1849, he was arrested for participating in discussions critical of the Tsar. He was sentenced to death by firing squad along with other members of the Petrashevsky Circle. The prisoners were led to the execution square and prepared to die. Standing before the rifles, Dostoevsky believed he had only minutes left to live. 3 prisoners were tied to posts. The soldiers took aim, and the drums began to beat. At the last possible moment, a messenger arrived with a pardon from the Tsar. The entire execution had been staged as psychological torture, planned in advance. This experience transformed Dostoevsky permanently and shaped everything he subsequently wrote. He gained an intense appreciation for the preciousness of each moment of existence. He also developed profound skepticism toward the radical ideologies that had led him there. The intellectual arrogance of utopian reformers seemed obscene to someone who had faced death. After the mock execution, Dostoevsky spent 4 years in a Siberian prison labor camp. He lived among common criminals, murderers, and the lowest elements of Russian society. This experience shattered his earlier intellectual pretensions about the common people. He encountered both profound evil and unexpected spiritual depth in his fellow prisoners. Dostoevsky emerged from prison with a renewed Christian faith and rejection of Western materialism. He came to believe that Russian peasants possessed authentic spirituality that intellectuals had lost. Suffering was not simply punishment, but the path through which redemption became possible. These convictions would animate his greatest novels over the following 3 decades. Nietzsche never experienced anything comparable to Dostoevsky's mock execution or imprisonment. His suffering was more internal: chronic illness, isolation, and the burden of his own insights. He collapsed into permanent madness in 1889 and died in 1900. But he had already seen clearly the crisis that the 20th century would fully reveal. The century that followed vindicated their diagnosis in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Secular ideologies promising earthly paradise produced unprecedented mass murder. Communism and fascism both emerged from the vacuum created by the death of God. These political religions offered meaning, community, and purpose without transcendent foundations. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, a character we will examine closely, predicted exactly this outcome. Remove genuine freedom and faith, give people bread and security, and they will obey any authority. Nietzsche predicted that the 20th century would be an era of unprecedented warfare and ideology. Both were vindicated by history in ways that should terrify us into taking their warnings seriously. Part 2. The Encounter, when Nietzsche found his only psychologist. Nietzsche discovered Dostoevsky by accident during the winter of 1886 to 87. He was browsing a bookshop in Nice when a French translation caught his attention. The book was titled L'Esprit Souterrain, a compilation containing notes from underground and another work. Nietzsche did not even recognize the author's name when he picked it up. Something about the volume drew him in immediately, an instinctive sense of recognition. He later wrote that he felt an instant kinship with this unknown Russian writer. The encounter proved transformative for Nietzsche's final productive years before his collapse. He would reference Dostoevsky repeatedly in his letters and late works. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche made his famous declaration about Dostoevsky. He called him the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. This statement is extraordinary from a thinker who dismissed most of Western philosophy as error. Nietzsche was not generous with praise, yet he elevated this novelist above professional philosophers. What did Nietzsche mean by calling Dostoevsky a psychologist? He did not mean psychology in the academic or clinical sense we use today. For Nietzsche, psychology meant the ability to penetrate human self-deception and hidden motivations. It meant understanding what people actually want beneath their conscious rationalizations. Dostoevsky's characters revealed the dark mechanisms of the human soul with unprecedented honesty. The underground man exposed how consciousness itself could become a disease. Raskolnikov showed how intellectual theories collapsed under the weight of actual experience. These were not morality tales, but rigorous investigations into human nature. Nietzsche recognized that Dostoevsky had independently discovered many of his own insights. The Russian novelist had mapped the territory of ressentiment before Nietzsche named it. He had shown how weakness transforms itself into moral superiority through psychological alchemy. This was exactly what Nietzsche was trying to expose in his Genealogy of Morals. In a letter to Georg Brandes in 1888, Nietzsche elaborated on this connection. He wrote that he was grateful to Dostoevsky in a remarkable way, but he added a crucial qualification. Dostoevsky went against his deepest instincts. This tension between kinship and opposition defined Nietzsche's relationship to the Russian master. Nietzsche admired the diagnosis but rejected the cure Dostoevsky proposed. Both saw the same sickness in modern humanity: paralysis, self-deception, spiritual emptiness, but Dostoevsky believed redemption came through Christian love and suffering. Nietzsche believed Christianity was itself the source of the disease, not its cure. The timing of this encounter matters enormously for understanding Nietzsche's late philosophy. He discovered Dostoevsky while writing on the Genealogy of Morals. The influence is visible in how Nietzsche develops his concept of resentment and slave morality. Dostoevsky had provided living examples of the psychology Nietzsche was theorizing about. There is no evidence that Dostoevsky ever read Nietzsche. The Russian novelist died in 1881, before Nietzsche became widely known. Their relationship was entirely one-directional. Nietzsche reading Dostoevsky, not the reverse. Yet Dostoevsky had anticipated Nietzschean themes decades before Nietzsche articulated them. This creates a fascinating interpretive situation for scholars. Dostoevsky's characters often embody what Nietzsche would later theorize in abstract philosophical terms. Raskolnikov acts out the logic of the Übermensch and discovers its impossibility. The underground man displays resentment in its purest, most self-aware form. Some scholars argue Dostoevsky was actually critiquing Nietzschean ideas before Nietzsche formulated them. This is chronologically impossible, but philosophically suggestive. Both thinkers were responding to the same cultural crisis with similar analytical tools. Their convergence reveals something deep about the problems they were confronting. The French translations Nietzsche read significantly shaped his interpretation of Dostoevsky. Scholars have shown these translations altered the text in important ways. The underground man became more purely psychological, less ideologically Russian. Nietzsche encountered a somewhat different character than Russian readers knew. This translation effect partly explains why Nietzsche could embrace Dostoevsky as a kindred spirit. The specifically Christian and Russian Orthodox elements were muted in French. What remained was the psychological penetration that Nietzsche most valued. He could appreciate the diagnosis while missing some of Dostoevsky's intended cure. Georg Brandes, the Danish critic, first connected Dostoevsky and Nietzsche in scholarly writing. His book, Impressions from Russia, interpreted Dostoevsky through Nietzschean categories. Brandes saw the Russian novelist as exemplifying resentment and slave morality. This interpretation established a template that shaped subsequent comparative scholarship. Lev Shestov, the Russian existentialist philosopher, offered a more provocative reading. He argued that Dostoevsky secretly shared Nietzsche's will to power as his deepest aim. The Christian endings of his novels were compromises, not authentic resolutions. Shestov saw both thinkers as philosophers of tragedy, confronting an indifferent universe. This scholarly debate continues today without resolution. Was Dostoevsky a proto-Nietzschean who lost his nerve at the final moment? Or was Nietzsche a brilliant reader who fundamentally misunderstood his Russian counterpart? The answer depends on how one interprets the relationship between their philosophies. What remains undeniable is that Nietzsche found in Dostoevsky a worthy interlocutor. The Russian novelist showed that the problems Nietzsche identified were real, not invented. If someone as different as Dostoevsky saw the same crisis, it could not be dismissed. Their agreement on the diagnosis made their disagreement about the cure all the more significant. Part 3. The Underground Man, Anatomy of Modern Consciousness. Notes from Underground appeared in 1864, over 2 decades before Nietzsche's mature works. Yet this short novel contains the most complete portrait of ressentiment ever created. Dostoevsky dramatized the psychology that Nietzsche would later theorize in philosophical prose. Understanding the underground man is essential for grasping what both thinkers diagnosed. The novella opens with a confession. I am a sick man, I am a spiteful man. The narrator immediately establishes himself as unreliable, self-contradictory, and fully aware of both. He knows he is sick, yet he refuses treatment. His spite gives him a perverse pleasure that he cannot relinquish. The underground man is not ignorant or stupid. He is hyperconscious, educated, and capable of seeing through every illusion. This very consciousness has become his disease. He cannot act because he sees too many sides of every question. A man of action, the underground man explains, is limited precisely because he can act. He takes some principle as foundational and moves forward without questioning it. The conscious man, by contrast, cannot find any firm ground to stand upon. Every justification for action dissolves under sufficiently rigorous analysis. This paralysis of hyper-awareness connects directly to contemporary research on decision-making. Psychologists have documented how excessive deliberation can undermine the capacity to choose. The phenomenon called analysis paralysis reflects exactly what Dostoevsky portrayed. Too much consciousness becomes an obstacle rather than an advantage. The underground man attacks the rational egoism fashionable among Russian progressives of his time. These thinkers believed humans naturally pursue their rational self-interest. Build a society that aligns individual interest with collective good, and utopia follows. The underground man recognizes this view fundamentally misunderstands human nature. Humans do not simply want rational satisfaction of their needs. They want to assert their will, to prove they are free and not mechanical. A person might deliberately choose against their interest just to demonstrate autonomy. The capacity for irrational choice is precisely what distinguishes persons from objects. This insight anticipates what behavioral economists discovered over a century later. Humans systematically deviate from rational utility maximization in predictable ways. We choose based on identity, emotion, social meaning, and narrative coherence. The underground man knew this through introspection before scientists confirmed it empirically. The underground man describes himself as a mouse rather than a man of action. When insulted, he cannot strike back immediately like a normal person would. Instead, he retreats into his corner and broods, analyzing, fantasizing revenge. The resentment ferments into something poisonous because it cannot be discharged. Nietzsche recognized this portrait as capturing exactly what he meant by ressentiment. The term describes a specific psychological dynamic, not ordinary resentment. It develops when a person feels powerless to act against perceived superiors. Unable to express hostility outward, they transform it through moral revaluation. The powerless person convinces themselves that their inability to fight is actually virtue. Weakness becomes humility, cowardice becomes patience, impotence becomes moral superiority. This psychological alchemy allows the weak to feel superior to the strong. The entire value system inverts to justify the position of the one who cannot act. The underground man displays this mechanism with agonizing self-awareness. He knows his moral posturing is compensation for his powerlessness. Yet knowing this does not free him from the pattern. His consciousness observes itself engaging in self-deception, but cannot stop. This self-aware resentment may be uniquely modern. Earlier forms of slave morality, as Nietzsche described them, were less conscious. The priests who invented Christian values may have genuinely believed their own revaluation. The underground man sees through himself and remains trapped nonetheless. In the second part of the novella, Dostoevsky shows resentment in action through concrete episodes. The underground man becomes obsessed with an officer who once brushed past him in a tavern. The officer did not even notice him, which makes the insult unbearable. For years, the underground man fantasizes about revenge while doing nothing. Finally, he decides to bump into the officer on the street as an assertion of equality. He borrows money to buy an expensive coat, so he will look respectable. After many failed attempts, he manages to collide with the officer on the sidewalk. The officer barely notices, but the underground man feels triumphant nonetheless. This episode perfectly illustrates the impotence of resentment-driven action. The grand revenge amounts to nothing that affects the actual power dynamic. The underground man's victory exists only in his own mind. Yet he needs this fantasy to maintain his sense of worth and dignity. The novella's most devastating section involves the prostitute Liza. The underground man encounters her in a brothel and delivers a sermon on her degradation. He paints a picture of the miserable future awaiting her and reduces her to tears. For a moment, he feels powerful, like a savior offering redemption. When Liza later comes to him seeking the connection he seemed to offer, everything collapses. The underground man cannot sustain his elevated pose in his own shabby apartment. He humiliates her cruelly to reassert dominance after his pretensions are exposed. His need to feel superior destroys the one person who responded to him genuinely. This cruelty reveals the dark heart of resentiment's moral posturing. The underground man preaches compassion but cannot actually give it. His morality is a weapon for establishing superiority, not genuine concern for others. When tested, his supposed virtue dissolves into the same will to power he condemns. Dostoevsky originally intended to include a chapter showing redemption through Christian faith. The censors removed the passages where the underground man found hope in Christ. What remains is pure negativity, the diagnosis without the cure. Nietzsche read precisely this truncated version in French translation. This accident of censorship shaped the entire subsequent interpretation of the work. Readers encountered the underground man as a pure case study in modern spiritual sickness. The Christian resolution Dostoevsky intended was invisible to most European readers. Nietzsche found a kindred spirit where Dostoevsky had meant to show a soul needing salvation. The underground man's consciousness resembles what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This brain system activates during self-referential thinking, rumination, and social comparison. Overactivity in this network correlates with depression, anxiety, and excessive self-focus. The underground man lives almost entirely in this mode of recursive self-examination. Meditation practices that reduce default mode, network activity consistently improve psychological well-being. The underground man represents the opposite, a mind trapped in endless self-reference. His inability to escape his own consciousness is both his defining feature and his prison. Dostoevsky intuited something about mental architecture that brain imaging later confirmed. Part 4. Raskolnikov's experiment, testing the Übermensch before Nietzsche. Crime and Punishment appeared in 1866, 2 decades before Nietzsche's mature philosophy. Yet the novel stages an experiment that directly tests Nietzschean ideas. Raskolnikov attempts to prove he belongs to a superior category of human being. His failure reveals something crucial about the limits of self-deification. Raskolnikov develops a theory dividing humanity into 2 categories. The ordinary masses exist to reproduce and maintain society through obedience. Extraordinary individuals possess the right to transgress conventional morality for higher purposes. Napoleon, for example, killed thousands, but is celebrated because he transformed history. This theory resembles what Nietzsche would later describe as the distinction between masters and slaves. Most humans accept morality as something imposed from outside, binding on everyone equally. The truly great recognize that they create values rather than submit to them. Conventional morality applies only to those who lack the strength to move beyond it. Raskolnikov decides to test whether he belongs among the extraordinary individuals. He plans to murder an elderly pawnbroker whom he considers a parasitic louse. The murder will prove his capacity to step beyond good and evil. He will use her money to finance great achievements that benefit humanity. The logic mirrors utilitarian calculations combined with Nietzschean self-overcoming. One worthless life sacrificed enables many worthy projects to succeed. Only conventional morality, the slave's limitation, would prohibit this rational exchange. The extraordinary man acts where the ordinary man only wrings his hands. Raskolnikov commits the murder, but the experiment immediately begins to fail. He also kills the pawnbroker's innocent sister, who arrives unexpectedly during the crime. He takes almost nothing of value and falls into a fever for days afterward. The clean, rational act becomes messy, traumatic, and psychologically devastating. The novel meticulously traces Raskolnikov's psychological disintegration following the murder. He cannot enjoy his supposed freedom from moral constraints. Instead, he is tormented by guilt, paranoia, and a compulsive desire to confess. His body and mind reject the theory his intellect had constructed. This rejection is not merely psychological weakness, Dostoevsky suggests. It reveals something true about human nature that the theory overlooked. Humans are not purely rational beings who can reconstruct themselves through ideology. We carry moral intuitions that cannot be erased by intellectual arguments. Contemporary neuroscience supports this Dostoevskian insight about moral psychology. Brain imaging shows that moral judgments involve emotional processing, not just reasoning. Damage to emotional brain regions impairs moral decision-making even when logic remains intact. We feel moral truth before we think it, and this feeling resists ideological override. Raskolnikov eventually confesses to the examining magistrate Porfiry Petrovich. But this confession does not yet constitute genuine repentance or transformation. He confesses partly from exhaustion, partly from a twisted pride in his crime. Even in confession, he remains trapped in his theory of extraordinary individuals. In the novel's epilogue, set during Raskolnikov's Siberian imprisonment, something shifts. Through the love of Sonia, a prostitute who followed him into exile, he begins to change. He picks up the New Testament and starts reading it. Dostoevsky suggests genuine transformation is beginning, though the process lies beyond the novel. Nietzsche would have seen Raskolnikov's failure as proving the opposite of what Dostoevsky intended. For Nietzsche, Raskolnikov fails because he is not actually an extraordinary individual. He remains infected with slave morality despite his intellectual rejection of it. A true Übermensch would not suffer guilt because his values would be genuinely transvalued. Lev Shestov argued that Dostoevsky himself secretly agreed with this Nietzschean interpretation. The epilogue's Christian redemption feels forced, tacked on to satisfy convention. Throughout the novel's body, the logic of the extraordinary man is never truly refuted. Shestov saw Dostoevsky as unable to follow his own insights to their terrifying conclusions. This scholarly debate illuminates a genuine ambiguity in the novel. Does Raskolnikov fail because his theory is wrong, or because he is too weak for it? Dostoevsky seems to intend the former, but the text allows the latter reading. Nietzsche could find support for his own views in a novel meant to refute them. The character Svidrigailov offers an alternative data point within the novel. He has committed terrible acts but feels no guilt or psychological torment. He lives according to pure self-interest without the burden Raskolnikov carries. Yet Svidrigailov eventually kills himself, suggesting this path also leads nowhere. Svidrigailov represents what Raskolnikov might have become with a stronger constitution. He succeeded where Raskolnikov failed in silencing his conscience. But this success brought only emptiness, boredom, and eventual self-destruction. Dostoevsky implies that even successful transgression of morality leads to spiritual death. For Nietzsche, Svidrigailov would represent decadence, not the Übermensch. The Übermensch is not a nihilistic sensualist pursuing pleasure and power without meaning. He is a creator of values who affirms life and channels his will into positive achievement. Svidrigailov's suicide demonstrates he never found anything worth living for. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what Nietzsche actually proposed. Critics often confuse the Übermensch with any powerful person who ignores conventional morality. but Nietzsche condemned such types as failed, decadent, or merely destructive. The Übermensch transforms himself and creates rather than simply indulging or destroying. Dostoevsky's novel may therefore attack a straw-man version of Nietzsche's later philosophy. Raskolnikov is a confused student with half-understood ideas, not a genuine philosopher. His theory is crude, his execution botched, his psychology unstable. He never represents the actual position Nietzsche would develop. Yet Dostoevsky's critique retains force because it targets a real human tendency. Most people who believe themselves extraordinary are actually Raskolnikovs, not Napoleons. The gap between intellectual self-concept and actual psychological reality is vast. Even if a true Übermensch were possible, most aspirants would be deluded imitators. This observation connects to documented psychological research on self-assessment. Humans systematically overestimate their abilities, especially in areas requiring skill. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows incompetent people most overrate their competence. Raskolnikov embodies this. He believes himself extraordinary but cannot sustain the role. Dostoevsky suggests that only genuine humility and love can save such deluded souls. Sonia embodies this alternative. She has suffered, degraded herself, yet retained faith. Her love for Raskolnikov comes without judgment or demand for transformation. This unconditional acceptance gradually opens him to change he could not achieve alone. Nietzsche would see Sonia as exemplifying exactly what he diagnosed as slave morality. Her self-sacrifice, her acceptance of suffering, her humble love represent ressentiment's values. She clings to the weak and drags the potentially strong down to her level. From Nietzsche's perspective, she is not saving Raskolnikov, but infecting him with her sickness. Part 5. The Grand Inquisitor versus Zarathustra. Two visions of human destiny. The Grand Inquisitor is a story within the brothers Karamazov, told by Ivan to his brother Alyosha. It contains Dostoevsky's most concentrated philosophical argument. The tale imagines Christ returning to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He is arrested by the Grand Inquisitor and accused of harming humanity. The setting is 16th century Seville, the day after 100 heretics were burned at the stake. Christ appears in the streets, and the people immediately recognize him. He performs miracles, healing the sick and raising a dead child. The Grand Inquisitor, an ancient cardinal, witnesses these events and orders Christ's arrest. That night, the Inquisitor visits Christ in his prison cell. What follows is a monologue, because Christ remains silent throughout the encounter. The Inquisitor explains why the Church no longer needs Christ and why his return is unwelcome. His argument strikes at the heart of freedom, human nature, and salvation. The Inquisitor's accusation centers on Christ's rejection of Satan's 3 temptations in the wilderness. Christ refused to turn stones into bread, to perform a miracle, and to accept earthly power. The Inquisitor argues these refusals placed an unbearable burden on humanity. Christ demanded that humans follow him freely, without coercion or material incentive. Freedom, says the Inquisitor, is the worst gift Christ could have given. Most humans cannot bear the weight of moral autonomy. They desperately want someone to tell them what to believe and how to live. Christ's demand that they choose freely condemns most of humanity to confusion and suffering. If Christ had turned stones into bread, humanity would have followed him for material security. If he had performed a miracle, they would have believed based on spectacle. If he had taken earthly power, he could have organized humanity under unified authority. Instead, he offered only freedom, which the weak cannot use and do not want. The Church, says the Inquisitor, has corrected Christ's error. It took upon itself the burden Christ refused to take. It provides miracle, mystery, and authority to satisfy humanity's real needs. The people are happy because they are told what to think and do. The Inquisitor admits he serves the devil, not Christ. But he claims this service is an act of compassion for weak humanity. Only a few thousand can bear the terrible burden of freedom Christ offered. The millions need bread, security, and someone to worship. This argument anticipates everything Nietzsche diagnosed about the human need for authority. Most people flee from freedom into the arms of whoever promises to relieve them of it. They want to be told that their lives have meaning, not to create meaning themselves. The Inquisitor understands this perfectly and exploits it systematically. Christ's silence throughout the Inquisitor's speech is theologically significant. He offers no counter-argument, no defense of freedom's value. At the end of the monologue, Christ simply kisses the Inquisitor on his bloodless lips. The Inquisitor, shuddering, tells him to go and never return, then releases him. What does Christ's silence mean? Some interpret it as showing that love transcends argument. Christ does not refute the Inquisitor because love is not a logical proposition. The kiss embodies what words cannot express: unconditional acceptance, even of his accuser. Zarathustra, Nietzsche's prophet figure, could not be more different from this silent Christ. He descends from his mountain specifically to speak, to teach, to proclaim. His speeches fill the book. Thus spoke Zarathustra with pronouncements and parables. Where Christ is silent, Zarathustra is relentlessly vocal. Zarathustra announces the Übermensch as a goal for humanity to strive toward. He teaches that humans must overcome themselves, creating new values beyond good and evil. The earth is where meaning must be made, not some promised afterlife. Those who hope for otherworldly redemption despise the only life they actually have. The Inquisitor and Zarathustra share a diagnosis, but propose opposite solutions. Both recognize that most humans cannot bear the burden of freedom. The Inquisitor concludes that authority must relieve them of this burden. Zarathustra concludes that humanity must evolve toward beings who can bear it. The Inquisitor is a compassionate pessimist about human nature. He accepts humanity as it is, weak, confused, hungry for direction. His authoritarian solution follows logically from this realistic assessment. Kindness, not cruelty, motivates his willingness to enslave for the sake of happiness. Zarathustra is an optimist about human potential, if not about current humanity. He despises the last men who seek only comfort and security. But he believes humanity can overcome itself and produce something higher. The Übermensch is not a fantasy, but an achievable goal for those who strive. This disagreement about human potential defines the entire Dostoevsky-Nietzsche confrontation. Can humans actually become free, self-creating beings who need no external authority? Or is the demand for such freedom a cruel joke played on creatures incapable of it? The answer determines everything about how society should be organized. The Grand Inquisitor anticipates 20th century totalitarianism with uncanny precision. Communist and fascist regimes promised exactly what the Inquisitor offers: bread, unity, purpose. They relieve people of the terrible burden of choosing their own values. The masses followed enthusiastically, as the Inquisitor predicted they would. Nietzsche also predicted that the death of God would produce an era of ideological warfare. He saw that the vacuum left by Christianity would be filled by secular religions. Nationalism, socialism and scientism would compete to provide what faith once gave. Both thinkers foresaw the catastrophes their century was preparing. The Inquisitor's argument has a contemporary version in debates about paternalism and liberty. Behavioral economists have shown that humans make predictably irrational decisions. Should governments nudge citizens toward better choices through designed environments? How much freedom should people have if they consistently use it poorly? Nietzsche would reject paternalism absolutely as another form of slave morality's triumph. The last men who want only happiness and comfort should not set the terms for everyone. Strong individuals must be free to create themselves, regardless of what masses prefer. Any system that constrains the highest for the sake of the lowest deserves contempt. Dostoevsky's position is more complex than simple anti-authoritarianism. He clearly presents the Inquisitor as wrong, aligned with the devil despite his compassion. But he also takes seriously the Inquisitor's argument about human weakness. The answer is not libertarian freedom, but freedom grounded in faith and love. Without Christ, freedom becomes unbearable, and people flee into slavery. With Christ, freedom becomes possible because it is supported by transcendent meaning. The Inquisitor's error is not his diagnosis of humanity, but his atheistic solution. He tries to manage without Christ what can only be healed through Christ. Part 6. The Meaning of Suffering. Crucible of redemption or obstacle to power. Suffering occupied the center of both Dostoevsky's and Nietzsche's thought. Neither offered comfortable reassurance that pain could be avoided or easily explained. Both insisted on confronting suffering honestly without illusion or evasion. Yet they reached radically different conclusions about what suffering means and does. Dostoevsky believed suffering was necessary for spiritual transformation and redemption. His characters achieve genuine change only through intense, often prolonged anguish. Raskolnikov's guilt torments him until he can finally accept love and begin healing. The path to God runs through the valley of suffering, not around it. This view has deep roots in Christian theology, especially Eastern Orthodox tradition. Kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ, models the soul's journey toward God. One must lose oneself to find oneself, die to be reborn. Suffering breaks the ego's self-sufficiency and opens it to grace. Father Zosima, the holy elder in the Brothers Karamazov, articulates this vision clearly. He teaches that we must love even suffering itself as part of creation. Every moment of existence, including pain, is a gift to be accepted with gratitude. This acceptance transforms suffering from meaningless torment into meaningful trial. Zosima's disciple Alyosha embodies this teaching throughout the novel. He moves through a world of violence, cruelty, and despair without being destroyed by it. His faith allows him to love even those who hate him and hurt others. Suffering becomes the crucible in which his compassion is tested and strengthened. Nietzsche utterly rejected the Christian interpretation of suffering as redemptive. He saw this belief as itself a symptom of the slave morality he diagnosed. The weak, unable to end their suffering, convince themselves it has transcendent meaning. This is psychological self-deception, making virtue of what they cannot change. For Nietzsche, Christianity taught people to love their suffering because they could not escape it. Slaves who cannot fight their masters redefine submission as holy obedience. The meek inherit the earth only in imagination, which is all they can manage. Redemptive suffering is ressentiment's greatest invention for dignifying powerlessness. Yet Nietzsche did not advocate avoiding or minimizing suffering. He believed suffering was necessary for growth, strength, and genuine achievement. The strong embrace suffering as resistance against which they develop their power. What Nietzsche rejected was the Christian interpretation, not suffering itself. Amor Fati, love of fate, is Nietzsche's formula for relating rightly to suffering. One should not merely accept suffering, but will it, affirm it, want it again. Every pain in your life made you who you are. To wish away any suffering is to wish away yourself. The eternal recurrence tests whether one has achieved Amor Fati. Could you affirm your life so completely that you would choose to relive it eternally? Every joy, but also every agony, repeated forever without change. Only someone who has transformed their relationship to suffering could say yes. This sounds similar to Dostoevsky's call to embrace suffering, but the meaning differs entirely. Dostoevsky says, suffering redeems because it connects us to Christ's sacrifice. Nietzsche says suffering enables because it strengthens the will that overcomes it. One points to transcendence, the other to immanent self-overcoming. Consider how each would interpret the same experience of intense pain. For Dostoevsky, the sufferer participates in Christ's passion and approaches salvation. The pain has meaning because it fits into a cosmic story of fall and redemption. One is not alone in suffering, but joined to all humanity and to God. For Nietzsche, the sufferer faces a test of their capacity for affirmation. Can they say yes to this pain as necessary for their becoming who they are? The pain has meaning only if the sufferer gives it meaning through their response. One is fundamentally alone, creating value rather than receiving it. These different interpretations produce different psychological and behavioral outcomes. Dostoevsky's view can provide comfort and community in the midst of suffering. You are not being punished. You are being prepared for something greater. This belief correlates with resilience and post-traumatic growth in psychological research. Nietzsche's view demands more, but potentially offers more as well. You must become strong enough to affirm everything that happens to you. This is harder than accepting suffering as divine gift. But successfully achieving Amor Fati produces a self-contained, unconquerable spirit. Both views reject the modern tendency to treat suffering as simply bad and to be eliminated. Contemporary culture often assumes happiness means absence of pain. We medicate suffering, distract from it, treat it as pathology requiring treatment. Neither Dostoevsky nor Nietzsche would accept this shallow understanding. Ivan Karamazov's rebellion against God centers on the suffering of innocent children. He can accept suffering that results from human choice and its consequences, but children who suffer through no fault of their own cannot be justified. No future harmony can retroactively make their tears acceptable. Ivan returns his ticket to God's creation because the price of entry is too high. He refuses to accept a universe where innocent suffering is necessary for cosmic harmony. Even if God could explain everything, Ivan would reject the explanation. Some things should not be forgiven, should not be justified, should not be accepted. Dostoevsky takes Ivan's argument with complete seriousness. He does not dismiss it as shallow atheism or moral confusion. The problem of innocent suffering is the strongest objection to theism. Dostoevsky's response through Zosima and Alyosha is experiential, not logical. Zosima's answer is not an argument, but a way of being. Active love for all creation, including suffering, transforms the experience of existence. One cannot prove that life is meaningful. One can only live meaningfully. Alyosha's kiss of the earth after Zosima's death enacts what cannot be said. Nietzsche would view Ivan's rebellion as itself a form of weakness and resentment. Demanding that the universe justify suffering to your satisfaction is slave morality thinking. The strong do not need cosmic justification. They create their own meaning. Ivan's moral outrage reveals his inability to affirm life unconditionally. Amor Fati would require affirming even the suffering of innocent children. This seems monstrous, and Nietzsche's critics have hammered this point repeatedly. How can anyone affirm Auschwitz, cancer in children, meaningless natural disasters? Nietzsche's philosophy here reaches its most demanding and most questioned extreme. One response is that Amor Fati does not mean approving of suffering or wishing for it. It means accepting that this universe with all its horror is the only one available. Wishing for a different universe is futile and life-denying. Affirmation is not moral approval, but existential acceptance of reality as it is. Part 7. What moves the soul? Will to power against kenotic love. What is the fundamental drive animating human existence? Nietzsche answered, the will to power, the drive to extend, grow, and overcome. Dostoevsky answered, the capacity for love, which finds fulfillment in giving itself away. These competing visions of human motivation structure their entire philosophies. Nietzsche developed the concept of will to power throughout his mature works. It appears most prominently in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. The term does not mean primarily the desire to dominate other people. It refers to the fundamental drive of all living things towards self-expansion and self-overcoming. Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's early influence, proposed that will to live was the primal drive. All organisms strive to survive and reproduce, perpetuating existence itself. Nietzsche found this explanation insufficient to account for human behavior. Humans often risk their lives for things that have nothing to do with survival. A person will sacrifice their life for honor, principle, creation, or glory. This makes no sense if survival is the ultimate value. Nietzsche concluded that life wants something more than mere continuation. It wants to increase, to overcome obstacles, to become more than it currently is. Will to power expresses itself differently in different types of people. In the strong, it manifests as creativity, achievement, and self-mastery. In the weak, it manifests as the desire to control others through morality and guilt. Slave morality is itself a form of will to power, just an underhanded, covert form. The saint and the tyrant both express will to power, according to Nietzsche. The saint gains power over himself through ascetic discipline and self-denial. He also gains power over others through moral authority and spiritual influence. What looks like self-abnegation is actually a subtle route to dominance. This analysis collapses the distinction between selflessness and selfishness entirely. Every apparently selfless act conceals a will to power seeking its expression. The mother, sacrificing for her children, extends herself through them. The martyr dying for a cause achieves immortal fame and posthumous influence. Dostoevsky offers a radically different vision through the concept of kenotic love. Kenosis means self-emptying, modelled on Christ emptying himself to become human. Genuine love does not seek its own advantage or expansion. It genuinely gives itself away without expectation of return or hidden agenda. Sonia, in Crime and Punishment, embodies this kenotic love. She has degraded herself through prostitution to support her family. When she loves Raskolnikov, she asks nothing from him, not even his reform. Her love persists despite his cruelty and her own suffering. Nietzsche would analyze Sonia as a textbook case of slave morality and ressentiment. She glorifies her own weakness and suffering as moral virtue. Her love is a strategy for gaining influence over Raskolnikov through his guilt. The appearance of selflessness conceals the reality of will to power. But Dostoevsky insists that Sonia's love is genuinely different from what Nietzsche describes. It does not originate from weakness or resentment, but from faith and grace. Christ's love for humanity models a giving that expects nothing back. Human love can participate in this divine pattern when grounded in faith. Who is right about the nature of love? Contemporary psychology offers evidence for both positions. Evolutionary psychologists have documented how apparent altruism often serves genetic self-interest. Kin selection and reciprocal altruism explain much seemingly selfless behavior. Parents sacrifice for children because children carry their genes. Friends help each other because reciprocity builds beneficial social networks. Even seemingly pure altruism towards strangers may enhance reputation and status. Nietzsche's analysis finds support in these biological and evolutionary explanations. Yet research also shows that humans are capable of genuine other-directed concern. Empathy involves neurological mirroring that makes others' pain truly felt as one's own. Acts of kindness activate reward circuits in ways that parallel selfish pleasure. We are wired for connection and care, not only for competition and power. The neuroscience of compassion suggests Dostoevsky may have identified something real. Loving others is not simply disguised self-interest, but a distinct mode of being. Contemplative practices that cultivate compassion produce measurable changes in brain function. The capacity for genuine love may be as fundamental as the will to power. Perhaps both drives coexist in human nature, irreducible to each other. Humans contain multitudes. We want to win and we want to love. Sometimes these drives align, sometimes they conflict. Neither Nietzsche's monism nor Dostoevsky's can fully capture this complexity. Nietzsche himself recognized that the highest expressions of will to power involve giving. The sun gives its light without asking anything in return. Zarathustra's gift-giving virtue overflows from abundance, not from weakness. Great souls give because they are full, not because they are empty. This version of giving resembles kenosis more than Nietzsche might have admitted. The difference is whether the giving originates from divine participation or natural abundance. Dostoevsky sees love as a channel for transcendent grace flowing through the person. Nietzsche sees it as the overflow of power that has nowhere else to go. Economics has explored this question through experiments on human cooperation. Behavioral economists find that humans cooperate more than pure self-interest predicts. We punish cheaters even at cost to ourselves, valuing fairness beyond personal gain. This suggests motivations beyond narrow will to power or genetic self-interest. Societies function because most people behave prosocially most of the time. Pure will to power unconstrained would make cooperation impossible. Social trust depends on the expectation that others will not always maximize their advantage. Some commitment to others' welfare seems necessary for civilization itself. Part 8. The Origins of Good and Evil. Genealogy against Revelation. Where does morality come from? This question defines the deepest difference between Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Nietzsche answered, "Morality is a human creation with a traceable historical origin." Dostoevsky answered, "Morality reflects divine reality that humans discover, not invent." Nietzsche's genealogy of morals conducts what he calls a genealogical investigation. This method traces concepts back to their historical and psychological origins. By showing how moral ideas arose from specific conditions and interests, they lose their appearance of timelessness. What seems natural and obvious turns out to be contingent and constructed. Nietzsche argues that the words good and bad originally had no moral meaning. Good simply meant noble, strong, beautiful, powerful. The aristocratic classes used it to describe themselves and their qualities. Bad meant common, low, weak, ugly, the qualities of those below. This original distinction carried no guilt or blame. Calling someone bad was like calling them plain or ordinary. It did not imply they had done wrong or deserved punishment. The nobles simply described the world as they experienced it from their position of power. The slave revolt in morality inverted this original meaning. Those who were called bad by the nobles reframed themselves as good in a different sense. They made their weakness into humility, their inability to fight into peacefulness. The qualities of the powerful became redefined as evil, a new term carrying condemnation. Evil, unlike the original bad, implies deliberate wrongdoing, deserving punishment. The slave morality required the concept of free will to make this work. If the strong freely choose their cruelty, they can be blamed and judged. Without free will, the strong are simply being what they are, like lions killing prey. Nietzsche traces this transvaluation of values through Judaism and then Christianity. The Jews, powerless against their imperial oppressors, achieve moral victory through redefinition. Rome conquered with swords, Judea conquered with values that eventually captured Rome itself. Christianity spread slave morality throughout the ancient world and into European civilization. Dostoevsky would reject this entire genealogical project as fundamentally misguided. Morality does not have the kind of human origin Nietzsche describes. Good and evil are real features of existence revealed by God, not invented by humans. Tracing historical development of moral concepts proves nothing about their ultimate truth. The fact that humans gradually came to understand moral truths does not make those truths human creations. Scientific understanding also developed historically, but that does not make physics arbitrary. Moral knowledge, like mathematical knowledge, could be discovered rather than invented. The genealogical method commits a genetic fallacy, confusing origin with validity. This objection has force that Nietzscheans must take seriously. Showing that moral concepts developed historically does not prove they are false. Perhaps humans gradually discovered what was always true about how to live. Origin and truth are different questions that genealogy tends to conflate. Nietzsche anticipated this response and argued that genealogy serves a different function. It does not directly refute moral claims, but undermines their authority. Knowing that values come from resentiment makes it harder to take them as absolute. Genealogy destabilizes rather than disproves, which is enough for Nietzsche's purposes. Dostoevsky's characters repeatedly confront the question of morality's ground. Even Karamazov articulates the problem clearly. Without God, everything is permitted. This does not mean atheists always behave badly. It means no objective basis exists for calling any behavior truly wrong. Many philosophers have tried to ground morality without God. Kant proposed that reason itself legislates universal moral duties. Utilitarians argued that maximizing happiness provides objective moral guidance. Nietzsche found all such attempts to be covert Christianity, keeping the conclusions while discarding the premises. If moral realism is true, as Dostoevsky believed, then some acts really are wrong, regardless of opinion. Murder is not merely disapproved of by most people. It genuinely violates something real. This reality is grounded in God's nature and creation. Without God, we lose the foundation that makes morality more than preference. Contemporary moral philosophy remains divided on exactly these questions. Moral realists argue that ethical truths exist independently of human attitudes. Anti-realists argue that morality is constructed, conventional, or expressive of emotion. The Dostoevsky-Nietzsche debate continues in different vocabulary among professional philosophers. Neuroscience has contributed new data without resolving the underlying question. We know that moral judgments involve both emotional and rational brain processes. We know that some moral intuitions appear cross-culturally and may be innate. But whether these intuitions track moral reality or just evolutionary programming remains contested. Evolutionary ethics tends to support something like Nietzsche's genealogical approach. Our moral intuitions arose because they promoted survival and reproduction in ancestral environments. Disgust at incest, for example, prevents genetic problems rather than tracking cosmic truth. This does not prove all morality is evolutionary adaptation, but it makes the genealogical method plausible. Dostoevsky might respond that God designed evolution to produce beings capable of moral knowledge. The naturalistic origin of moral intuitions is compatible with their tracking divine truth. Just as God designed eyes that accurately perceive physical reality, he designed consciences that perceive moral reality. Evolution is the mechanism. God's purpose is the explanation. This debate cannot be settled by philosophical argument alone. At some level, one must decide what kind of universe one believes in. Is reality ultimately meaningless matter, as Nietzsche held? Or is it the creation of a personal God who establishes moral order? Both positions require faith, though different kinds of faith. Materialism cannot be proven true any more than theism can. Nietzsche's genealogy assumes a godless universe. Dostoevsky's ethics assumes a God-created one. The choice between them is not a matter of following evidence to its obvious conclusion. Part 9. Ivan's Rebellion and Amor Fati. Two responses to innocent suffering. Ivan Karamazov's argument against God is considered one of the strongest ever formulated. He does not deny God's existence. He denies that any God who exists deserves worship. His rebellion centers on the suffering of innocent children, which cannot be justified. Understanding his argument reveals what Dostoevsky believed required a response. Ivan tells Alyosha stories of children being tortured, abused, and killed. These are not hypothetical. Dostoevsky drew them from actual Russian court cases. A general who sets dogs on a peasant boy for slightly injuring his favourite hound. Parents who lock their daughter in an outhouse overnight in freezing weather. Ivan can accept that adults suffer for their sins and choices. He can understand suffering as consequence, punishment, or even purgation. But children have not sinned. They have made no choices that merit torment. Their suffering serves no comprehensible moral purpose whatsoever. Theologians often explain suffering as necessary for free will or soul-making. Without the possibility of choosing wrongly, genuine freedom would not exist. Without challenges and difficulties, character could not develop. Ivan rejects these explanations as applied to children who cannot yet choose or develop. Even if some future harmony would make everything worthwhile, Ivan refuses it. He will not accept that the tears of one tortured child are a necessary price. No cosmic reconciliation can retroactively justify what happened to that child. Ivan returns his ticket to heaven, wanting no part of a system built on such foundations. The logic is relentless. If innocent suffering is permitted, God is not good as claimed. If God could prevent it but does not, his goodness is compromised. If he cannot prevent it, his power is limited. If he has reasons we cannot understand, he owes us an explanation before demanding worship. Ivan's rebellion is morally motivated, not intellectually motivated. He does not doubt God exists. He refuses to accept the God who exists. His conscience will not permit him to worship a being who tolerates such horror. Moral outrage trumps theological reasoning for Ivan. Dostoevsky does not have Alyosha refute Ivan's argument with counter-arguments. Alyosha has no theodicy, no philosophical answer to the problem of innocent suffering. He can only point to Christ as one who shares human suffering rather than explaining it. The response is personal, not logical, a relationship rather than a proposition. The Grand Inquisitor tale that follows Ivan's rebellion shows where his logic leads. If God's gift of freedom causes such suffering, freedom itself is the problem. Better to remove freedom and give humanity bread, security, and managed happiness. Ivan's moral rebellion against God logically ends in the Inquisitor's totalitarian solution. Dostoevsky implies that rejecting God on moral grounds does not produce better morality. It produces either nihilism or tyranny, the two possibilities explored throughout the novel. Ivan's conscience, which rebels against divine injustice, cannot sustain itself without divine grounding. He ends the novel in mental breakdown, talking to a devil who may be his hallucination. Nietzsche's response to innocent suffering could not be more different. Amor Fati requires affirming everything that happens, including the worst horrors. Not approving morally, but accepting as part of the whole that makes existence what it is. This sounds monstrous, and Nietzsche's critics have never stopped pointing this out. What does it mean to affirm Auschwitz, cancer in children, natural disasters that kill indiscriminately? One interpretation is that affirmation does not mean moral approval. You can affirm that something exists while wishing it did not, or working to prevent it. Amor Fati means not torturing yourself with fantasy about alternate universes. Another interpretation is that Nietzsche demands something truly superhuman. The Übermensch can affirm even horror because his yes-saying transcends ordinary morality. This places Nietzsche's ideal beyond the reach of normal human conscience. Perhaps only the Übermensch, not ordinary people, can achieve Amor Fati fully. The eternal recurrence thought experiment tests whether one has achieved this affirmation. Could you will your entire life, including every suffering you witnessed, to recur eternally? Most people cannot honestly answer yes to this question. Ivan Karamazov certainly could not. His conscience revolts at the very idea. Nietzsche might respond that Ivan's rebellion is itself a form of weakness. Demanding that the universe justify itself to your moral standards is resentment. The strong affirm what is. The weak complain that what is fails to meet their standards. Ivan's moral outrage reveals his inability to say yes to life unconditionally. But this response seems inadequate when confronted with actual tortured children. Calling moral outrage weakness does not make the children's suffering acceptable. Nietzsche's philosophy has difficulty accommodating the sense that some things simply should not be. Amor Fati threatens to become indifference, masquerading as courage. Dostoevsky's response through Zosima and Alyosha offers something Nietzsche's philosophy lacks. Active love that does not require explaining or affirming suffering, only responding to it. One does not need to justify the child's tears. One needs to wipe them away. Practical compassion replaces both theodicy and amor fati. Contemporary psychology offers some support for Dostoevsky's approach. Helping others in their suffering reduces one's own distress better than philosophical reframing. Meaning comes not from affirming horror, but from working against it. Perhaps Amor Fati describes a pathology of detachment rather than a healthy ideal. Yet Nietzsche's challenge to Ivan's rebellion retains force. If you cannot accept the universe as it is, you are at war with existence itself. This war cannot be won and produces only bitterness and exhaustion. Some form of acceptance may be necessary for sanity and continued action. The difference may lie in what acceptance means. Accepting that reality includes terrible suffering does not require affirming it as good. One can acknowledge what is while still committing to change what can be changed. This middle path between Ivan's rebellion and Amor Fati may be psychologically wisest. Part 10. The Terrible Gift of Freedom. Why Humans Choose Chains. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche recognized that freedom terrifies most people. The Grand Inquisitor accused Christ of burdening humanity with unbearable liberty. Nietzsche despised the last men who want only comfort, not the risk of self-creation. Yet their explanations for why humans flee freedom diverged fundamentally. The Inquisitor's argument rests on an assessment of human nature as weak. Most people cannot bear the weight of choosing their own values and meaning. They want someone to tell them what is true, good, and worth living for. Freedom without guidance produces anxiety, confusion, and misery. Psychologist Erich Fromm explored this phenomenon in Escape from Freedom in 1941. He argued that modern freedom creates an isolated, anxious individual. Cut off from traditional communities and beliefs, the modern self feels unbearably alone. Totalitarian movements succeed by promising to relieve this burden through submission. Contemporary research on choice overload confirms that more options can decrease well-being. When people face too many choices, they become paralyzed or later regret their decisions. Unlimited freedom to choose produces less satisfaction than constrained choices. The Inquisitor anticipated what psychologists would document a century later. For Dostoevsky, the problem with freedom is that humans abuse it. Given the choice between good and evil, we often choose evil. Freedom without faith degenerates into license, egoism, and ultimately destruction. The Inquisitor's solution eliminates freedom to prevent its misuse. But Dostoevsky believes this solution is worse than the disease. Freedom that can be abused is still better than slavery that cannot. Christ's gift was not a burden, but an opportunity for genuine love. Love must be freely given, or it is not love at all. Genuine freedom, for Dostoevsky, is found only in Christ. The freedom to do whatever you want is actually bondage to desire. True freedom is the capacity to will what is good, which requires grace. Alyosha lives freely because his will aligns with divine will through faith. Nietzsche's analysis of why humans flee freedom focuses on different mechanisms. The weak lack the strength to create their own values and bear their own existence. They need the herd for protection, identity, and shared meaning. Slave morality is itself a strategy for managing the anxiety of freedom. By defining themselves as morally superior to the strong, the weak achieve a kind of security. They no longer need to become great. Greatness itself is redefined as evil. The race is rigged so that doing nothing becomes winning. This removes the burden of striving while providing the comfort of self-righteousness. The herd mentality further reinforces the escape from freedom. When everyone believes the same things, no individual must justify their beliefs. The responsibility for choosing is offloaded onto the group. One simply does what everyone does and believes what everyone believes. Nietzsche despised this conformity as the death of everything valuable in humanity. The last men who have invented happiness are the ultimate product of herd morality. They want only comfort, security, and the avoidance of risk. Nothing great can emerge from such timid, self-satisfied creatures. The Übermensch is precisely the one who does not flee from freedom. He embraces the burden of creating his own values without external support. He does not need the herd's approval or the comfort of shared beliefs. His freedom is terrible, but also the source of everything that gives life meaning. But how many can actually achieve this? Nietzsche never claimed that everyone could or should become an Übermensch. He was an aristocratic thinker who believed only the few have the capacity for genuine freedom. The many will always need some form of external guidance and authority. This creates a political problem that neither Dostoevsky nor Nietzsche fully resolved. If most people cannot bear freedom, how should society be organized? Democracy assumes that ordinary people can govern themselves. Both thinkers had doubts about this assumption, though for different reasons. Dostoevsky feared that democracy without faith would produce mob rule and tyranny. The masses, unguided by Christian values, would follow demagogues promising bread and circuses. Russian orthodoxy provided the spiritual foundation for a properly ordered society. Without it, the Inquisitor's solution would be adopted by secular authorities. Nietzsche feared that democracy was the political expression of slave morality. Rule by the majority means rule by the mediocre, the herd, the last men. True excellence requires the freedom to rise above what ordinary people approve. Democracy levels everything down to the lowest common denominator. Both predictions have some support in 20th century history. Democracies have sometimes produced exactly the conformism and mediocrity Nietzsche feared. Totalitarian alternatives have produced exactly the bread and authority exchange Dostoevsky predicted. Neither pure freedom nor its abolition has produced the results their advocates promised. Contemporary neuroscience adds another dimension to this analysis. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and self-control, is the last brain region to mature. It does not fully develop until the mid-20s in most people. Some individuals show deficits in this region that limit their capacity for autonomous decision-making. If freedom requires certain cognitive capacities that are unevenly distributed, equality becomes problematic. Not everyone may be equally capable of the self-governance that freedom demands. This empirical reality supports both the Inquisitor's pessimism and Nietzsche's aristocratism. Perhaps some people genuinely need more guidance than others. Yet both thinkers would reject the conclusion that scientists should design optimal social systems. Dostoevsky's entire work attacks the crystal palace of rational social engineering. Nietzsche condemned the scientific worldview as another form of slave morality's triumph. Whatever the limits of human freedom, neither would entrust it to technocratic managers. The question remains open. What social arrangements best balance freedom's risks and benefits? No purely philosophical answer exists. History is the laboratory where experiments are conducted. The 20th century tested many proposals with catastrophic results. Perhaps the 21st century will find better balances that neither thinker could envision. Part 11. Becoming Who You Are. Two Models of the Self. What does it mean to become yourself? Nietzsche commanded, "Become who you are," suggesting the self is achieved, not given. Dostoevsky portrayed characters who discover their true selves through repentance and grace. These competing models of selfhood carry profound implications for how one should live. Nietzsche rejected the idea that humans have a fixed essence waiting to be discovered. The self is not found, but created through the process of self-overcoming. You are what you make of yourself through your choices, struggles, and creative acts. There is no true self hiding beneath the surface, only the self you are becoming. This view aligns with existentialist philosophy that would develop after Nietzsche. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence expresses a similar idea. Humans are not born with a predetermined nature that dictates what they should become. We are radically free to define ourselves through our actions and commitments. Self-overcoming is the process by which the self transcends its current limitations. Whatever you are now is raw material for what you might become. The drives and impulses within you must be organized, disciplined, and given form. This is artistic work. You are both the sculptor and the sculpture. Nietzsche admired figures like Goethe, who gave style to their characters. Goethe took his contradictory impulses and organized them into a unified whole. He did not suppress parts of himself, but integrated them into a coherent life. This integration is what Nietzsche means by becoming who you are. The metaphor of giving style to one's character comes from aesthetics, not morality. The question is not whether your life is good in a moral sense. The question is whether your life is beautiful, powerful, worthy of admiration. Aesthetic criteria replace moral criteria as the standard for evaluating existence. Dostoevsky offers a fundamentally different model of the self and its transformation. The self is not created but received, damaged by sin and restored through grace. You do not make yourself. You discover what God made you to be. The journey is not self-overcoming, but repentance and return. In the Christian understanding Dostoevsky embraced, humans are created in God's image. This divine image is obscured by sin, but never entirely destroyed. Redemption involves recovering the true self that sin has buried. You become who you are by returning to who you were always meant to be. Raskolnikov's transformation illustrates this model. His theories about extraordinary individuals led him away from his true self. The murder was not self-creation, but self-destruction, a betrayal of his nature. Recovery requires abandoning the false self and accepting the true one. The epilogue shows Raskolnikov beginning this return through Sonia's love and the New Testament. He does not overcome himself in Nietzsche's sense. He surrenders the self he tried to create and opens himself to grace. This surrender is not weakness, but the precondition for genuine transformation. Alyosha in The Brothers. Karamazov embodies the self that has never strayed far from its source. He struggles, doubts, and faces temptation, but his fundamental orientation remains toward God. His self does not need radical reconstruction, only continued growth in love. He discovers more deeply what he already is, rather than becoming something new. These two models produce different relationships to one's past. For Nietzsche, the past is material to be overcome or affirmed through Amor, Fati. You can say, I willed it thus, claiming ownership of everything that happened. The past does not determine you, you determine the meaning of your past. For Dostoevsky, the past includes real guilt that cannot simply be reframed. Sin is not a story you can rewrite, but a wound requiring healing. Forgiveness, not affirmation, is the proper response to genuine wrongdoing. You cannot will that your sins were good. You can only accept that they are forgiven. Contemporary psychology has explored questions of self and identity extensively. Narrative psychology suggests that we construct our identities through the stories we tell. This seems to support Nietzsche. The self is a narrative creation, not a discovered essence. But research also shows that some core personality traits remain stable across the lifespan. The Big Five personality traits show remarkable consistency from childhood through old age. Extraversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness form a stable core. This suggests something like an essential self that persists through change. Perhaps Dostoevsky was right that we discover rather than create ourselves. Neuroscience complicates both pictures by showing how malleable the brain actually is. Neuroplasticity means that experience continually reshapes neural architecture. We literally become different people as our brains change through learning and practice. Yet the basic structure of the brain constrains what kinds of changes are possible. The tension between plasticity and constraint mirrors the Nietzsche-Dostoevsky debate. We can change ourselves significantly, supporting Nietzsche's self-overcoming. But we cannot change ourselves infinitely, supporting Dostoevsky's given nature. Both self-creation and self-discovery may be partial truths about the human condition. What practical difference do these models make? Nietzsche's model encourages experimentation, risk-taking, and refusal of conventional limits. You are not bound by what you have been. You can always become something different. This produces dynamic, creative lives, but also potential instability and rootlessness. Dostoevsky's model encourages humility, acceptance, and trust in something beyond oneself. You do not need to invent yourself. You need to find your way home. This produces grounded, connected lives, but also potential passivity and conformism. Neither model is without its characteristic dangers and limitations. Part 12. Against the Crystal Palace, the shared war on utopian rationalism. Despite their fundamental differences, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche shared a common enemy. Both attacked the optimistic rationalism that believed science could perfect human society. The Crystal Palace became Dostoevsky's symbol for this utopian dream. Nietzsche's Last Men represent its ultimate horrifying achievement. The Crystal Palace was an actual building constructed in London for the 1851 exhibition. It represented the triumph of industrial civilization, science, and rational planning. Russian radicals like Chernyshevsky used it as a symbol of the future socialist utopia. A perfectly organized society where all human needs would be satisfied through rational design. The underground man attacks this vision with savage intensity. He insists that humans do not want rational satisfaction of their needs. They want to assert their will, to prove they are not parts of a machine. A person might deliberately act against their interest just to show they are free. The Crystal Palace offers everything except the one thing humans most require: freedom. If every desire is satisfied by rational arrangement, what room remains for choice? The perfectly designed society removes the struggle that gives life meaning. Humans would rather suffer in freedom than flourish in a determined paradise. Dostoevsky saw the utopian rationalists as profoundly misunderstanding human nature. They assumed humans are essentially rational beings, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Build the right system, and people will happily cooperate for mutual benefit. This ignores the irrational, spiritual, destructive dimensions of the human soul. The 20th century vindicated Dostoevsky's warnings in the most horrific ways. Communist regimes attempted to build exactly the rational utopias the radicals envisioned. The result was not paradise, but unprecedented mass murder and totalitarian control. The Crystal Palace became the Gulag, the re-education camp, the killing field. Nietzsche attacked the same optimistic rationalism from a different angle. He saw it as the culmination of slave morality's triumph. The last men want only comfort, security, and the elimination of suffering. They have invented happiness and blink contentedly at their own mediocrity. The last men are not evil but contemptible. They have no great ambitions, no willingness to risk, no capacity for genuine achievement. They want everyone to be equal, meaning equally small. Their happiness is the happiness of cattle, not of fully realized human beings. Zarathustra announces the Übermensch partly as an alternative to the last man. Humanity must choose between these two futures, the Übermensch or the last man. One represents the highest possibility of human achievement and self-overcoming. The other represents the comfortable extinction of everything that makes humanity valuable. Both thinkers diagnose the same pathology in progressive optimism. It reduces humans to their material needs and ignores their spiritual depths. It assumes that happiness is the ultimate goal when humans actually seek meaning. It tries to eliminate suffering when suffering is necessary for growth and nobility. Contemporary debates about technology and human enhancement echo these concerns. Transhumanists promise to eliminate disease, aging, and perhaps death itself. They envision a future where all limitations are overcome through technological progress. This is the Crystal Palace rebuilt with silicon and genetic engineering. Would such a future produce flourishing or the last men? If all struggle is removed, what would humans strive for? If death is conquered, what urgency would motivate achievement? Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche would view this technological utopia with horror. The underground man's objection applies directly to technological utopianism. Humans might deliberately sabotage their own enhancement just to prove they are free. We might choose suffering over happiness if happiness is imposed rather than chosen. The irrational element in human nature cannot be engineered away. Nietzsche would add that the technological utopia represents will to power turned against itself. The drive that created science and technology would be extinguished by its own success. Having conquered all external obstacles, humans would have nothing left to overcome. The Übermensch needs resistance. He cannot exist in a frictionless paradise. Both thinkers would reject the assumption that progress is always good. Progress toward the Crystal Palace is progress toward spiritual death. Some directions that seem like advancement are actually decline. The measure of a civilization is not its comfort, but its capacity to produce greatness. Yet neither offered a clear political alternative to the rationalism they attacked. Dostoevsky vaguely invoked Russian orthodoxy and Slavophile nationalism. Nietzsche vaguely invoked future philosophers who would legislate new values. Neither provided a blueprint for organizing society without rationalist planning. This absence may be intentional rather than a failure. Both distrusted systems and blueprints as themselves products of rationalist thinking. The answer to bad planning is not better planning, but something beyond planning. Living individuals must find their own way. No system can do it for them. Perhaps the shared lesson is that human problems cannot be solved, only lived with. The rationalist believes that correct analysis yields correct solutions. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche believed that existence is tragic, not a problem to be solved. Wisdom consists not in fixing the human condition, but in bearing it nobly. Part 13. Christianity on Trial, Prosecution and Defense. Nietzsche's attack on Christianity is among the most sustained and vicious in intellectual history. He called it the one great curse, the immortal blemish on humanity. Dostoevsky defended Christianity, but not through apologetic arguments. He showed through his characters what Christian faith looks like when genuinely lived. Nietzsche's critique begins with the claim that Christianity is slave morality institutionalized. It originated among the powerless who could not achieve victory through strength. Unable to defeat their masters, they achieved revenge through moral revaluation. The meek shall inherit the earth is the battle cry of those who cannot fight. Christianity glorifies everything that Nietzsche considers weak and life-denying. Humility, self-denial, poverty, suffering, and submission are elevated to virtues. Pride, strength, beauty, and power are condemned as sins. The entire value system is designed to make the strong feel guilty for being strong. The concept of sin is particularly pernicious in Nietzsche's analysis. It teaches people to feel guilty about their natural instincts and desires. Sexuality, aggression, ambition, and self-assertion are all condemned. Christians learn to hate themselves for being human, for having bodies and drives. The afterlife functions to make slaves accept their earthly condition. Do not rebel now, your reward comes later in heaven. Meanwhile, your oppressors will suffer eternal punishment for their power and pleasure. This is resentiment's fantasy of revenge projected onto cosmic scales. Nietzsche reserves special contempt for the ascetic priest who administers this system. The priest gains power by making people sick and then offering himself as the cure. He creates guilt, then provides confession and absolution. His authority depends on maintaining the disease he claims to heal. The Antichrist, written in 1888, concentrates this critique with maximum intensity. Nietzsche accuses Christianity of waging war against everything noble in humanity. It has systematically destroyed classical civilization's healthier values. 2,000 years of Christian dominance have produced a diminished, self-loathing species. Dostoevsky would not deny that Christianity has been corrupted and misused. The Grand Inquisitor represents exactly the institutional betrayal Nietzsche condemns. The Church has often sought power, wealth, and control rather than serving Christ. Dostoevsky knew the difference between Christianity and Christendom, but Dostoevsky insists that the corruption proves nothing about the truth of the faith. Humans corrupt everything they touch. This is precisely what Christianity teaches. The failure of Christians to live their faith does not invalidate the faith itself. One must distinguish the ideal from its flawed human embodiments. Father Zosima embodies what genuine Christianity looks like when actually practiced. He is not weak, resentful, or life-denying in any sense Nietzsche would recognize. His humility comes from strength, not weakness. His love for creation encompasses everything, including the beauty Nietzsche values. Zosima teaches active love, not passive resignation. Go out and love concretely, not abstractly. Serve the person in front of you, not humanity in general. This love requires strength, courage, and perseverance, not weakness. Zosima's teaching about universal guilt challenges Nietzsche's critique directly. Each person is responsible for all, guilty before all, for everything. This is not ressentiment's accusation against the strong. It is the recognition that we are all connected, all implicated, all in need of mercy. Alyosha carries Zosima's teaching into the world after the elder's death. He does not withdraw from life, but engages it with compassion and presence. His final speech to the boys after Ilyusha's funeral is life-affirming. Memory of good moments gives strength to face whatever comes. Nietzsche might respond that Zosima and Alyosha are exceptional, not representative. Most Christians are not saints, but ordinary people using faith for comfort and self-righteousness. The typical believer displays exactly the ressentiment and weakness Nietzsche diagnosed. Dostoevsky's saints are idealizations that distort the reality of Christian life. This empirical question about typical believers cannot be settled by philosophy alone. Psychological research on religious people shows a complex, mixed picture. Some believers display the rigidity and resentment Nietzsche described. Others display the generosity, resilience, and life affirmation Dostoevsky portrayed. Religion correlates with both positive and negative psychological outcomes. Believers report higher life satisfaction and cope better with adversity on average. But certain forms of religiosity correlate with authoritarianism and prejudice. The data supports neither a blanket condemnation nor a blanket endorsement. Perhaps the crucial variable is how faith is held, not whether it is held. Faith grounded in love and openness produces different fruits than faith grounded in fear. Dostoevsky's characters show both possibilities within Christianity itself. The Inquisitor and Zosima are both Christians with radically different orientations. Nietzsche acknowledged that he admired Jesus while condemning Christianity. Jesus himself was not a resentful slave, but an original who lived his own values. The problem was Paul and the church that transformed Jesus into a system. They took a free spirit and built an institution of guilt and control around him. Dostoevsky might partially agree with this distinction. Christ's silence before the Inquisitor shows that the Church has betrayed its founder. But Dostoevsky believed the true Church still exists within the corrupt institution. The Zosimas and Alyoshas preserve what the Inquisitors have abandoned. Part 14. Demons and Last Men. Prophesying the 20th Century. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche foresaw catastrophe approaching. They predicted that the death of God would unleash unprecedented violence and ideology. The 20th century vindicated their warnings beyond anything they could have imagined. Understanding their prophecies illuminates both the past and our possible futures. Dostoevsky's novel Demons, also translated as The Possessed or The Devils, appeared in 1872. It portrays a group of revolutionary nihilists who bring chaos to a provincial Russian town. The characters are based on actual radicals Dostoevsky had known and read about. The novel predicts with uncanny accuracy what Russian revolutionaries would actually do. The revolutionaries in Demons operate through manipulation, deception, and violence. They exploit legitimate grievances to advance their own will to power. Their idealism masks a nihilistic contempt for the people they claim to serve. Once in control, they reveal themselves as tyrants, worse than those they replaced. Peter Verkovensky, the chief revolutionary, explicitly describes his method. He will raise rebellion, then establish dictatorship under the guise of liberation. The masses will exchange one master for another while believing themselves free. This is exactly what Lenin and Stalin would accomplish decades later. Shigalyov, another character, presents a theoretical system for the perfect society. Starting from unlimited freedom, he arrives at unlimited despotism. The logic is inexorable. To guarantee equality, you must suppress all who rise above average. Utopia requires total control, which means totalitarianism. Kirillov proposes a different response to the death of God. Suicide as self-assertion. If there is no God, man must become God through absolute exercise of will. The ultimate act of will is choosing death, proving that nothing controls you. His suicide is meant to liberate humanity from fear and open the way to the man-God. Dostoevsky shows that all these paths lead to destruction. The revolutionaries murder, manipulate, and ultimately destroy themselves and others. Kirillov's suicide accomplishes nothing except his own death. The town is left in ruins, with the chaos spreading outward. The novel's title comes from the gospel story of demons entering a herd of pigs. The pigs rush down a slope into the sea and drown. Dostoevsky saw the revolutionary movement as demonic possession of Russian society. The possessed would destroy themselves and drag many innocent victims with them. Nietzsche's prophecies appear throughout his late works, especially in scattered aphorisms. He predicted that the 20th century would see wars of unprecedented scale and ideology. The death of God would leave a vacuum that political religions would fill. Nationalism, socialism, and other mass movements would provide what Christianity once gave. Nietzsche did not view this coming catastrophe with Dostoevsky's moral horror. He saw it as necessary birth pangs of a new era. The old values had to be destroyed before new ones could be created. The violence would clear the ground for the Übermensch to emerge. This difference in emotional response separates the two thinkers profoundly. Dostoevsky mourned the coming destruction and sought to avert it through faith. Nietzsche anticipated it with something like excited dread. Both saw the same future. They evaluated it completely differently. The actual 20th century surpassed both their imaginations in its horrors. World wars killed tens of millions in industrialized slaughter. Communist regimes murdered their own citizens by the tens of millions more. Fascism and Nazism produced genocide and continental devastation. Dostoevsky would have seen these events as confirmation of what happens when faith dies. Without God, everything is permitted, including the previously unthinkable. The revolutionaries he portrayed in Demons multiplied across the planet. His warnings went unheeded, and the consequences were catastrophic. Nietzsche's legacy became tragically entangled with Nazism, though he bore no direct responsibility. His sister Elizabeth edited his unpublished notes to support German nationalism and anti-Semitism. The Nazis claimed Nietzsche as a philosophical forefather, distorting his ideas grotesquely. Nietzsche himself despised anti-Semitism and German nationalism explicitly and repeatedly. Yet Nietzsche's rhetoric about the strong dominating the weak could be misused. His contempt for slave morality and democracy invited authoritarian appropriation. Even if the Nazis misread him, they found something in his texts to exploit. The question of Nietzsche's political implications remains contested among scholars. Both thinkers would likely be horrified by how the 20th century actually unfolded. Dostoevsky would see his worst fears realized, but would not have wanted to be right. Nietzsche might have hoped for creative destruction, but received only destruction. Neither envisioned the sheer scale of mechanized murder that modernity enabled. The 21st century faces new versions of the same underlying crisis. Religious belief continues to decline in developed nations. Ideological movements continue to promise meaning to those who feel lost. The questions both thinkers raised remain unanswered and urgent. Technology has added new dimensions they could not have anticipated. Social media creates new forms of herd mentality and resentment. Artificial intelligence raises questions about human purpose and dignity. The Crystal Palace now has silicon foundations and algorithmic management. Their prophecies remain relevant because the underlying human needs persist. People still need meaning, purpose, and something worth living for. Neither technology nor politics has provided adequate substitutes for transcendence. The choice between their proposed solutions remains before us. Part 15. The Scientific Verdict, Neuroscience, Psychology, and Evolution. Modern science has generated vast data relevant to the Dostoevsky-Nietzsche debate. Neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and behavioral research illuminate their claims. Neither thinker is simply vindicated or refuted by empirical findings. Both captured genuine aspects of human nature while missing others. Nietzsche's claim that will to power is the fundamental drive finds partial support in research. Humans do show strong motivations for status, dominance, and influence. Social hierarchies form spontaneously in groups, with individuals competing for position. Testosterone correlates with dominance-seeking behavior across many contexts, but research also shows that humans are fundamentally social and cooperative. We have innate capacities for empathy, fairness, and concern for others. mirror neurons allow us to feel others' experiences as though they were our own. This suggests that love and connection are as basic as power and dominance. The evolutionary perspective suggests both drives have adaptive value. Competition for status improved reproductive success in ancestral environments, but cooperation and group bonding also enhance survival. Humans evolved to be both competitive and cooperative, both selfish and altruistic. Nietzsche's analysis of resentment finds striking confirmation in social psychology. People who feel powerless often engage in downward social comparison to feel better. Hostile attribution bias leads the resentful to perceive slights where none exist. Moral outrage frequently masks envy and status anxiety. Research on Schadenfreude, pleasure at others' misfortune, reveals the dynamics Nietzsche described. People feel more Schadenfreude toward those they envy or perceive as superior. This pleasure is associated with activation in reward circuits of the brain. We are wired to enjoy the downfall of those we resent. Dostoevsky's emphasis on suffering as potentially transformative also finds empirical support. Post-traumatic growth is a documented phenomenon where adversity leads to positive change. People who struggle with difficult experiences sometimes emerge stronger and wiser. Suffering does not automatically destroy. It can catalyze development. The conditions under which suffering produces growth versus destruction have been studied. Social support, meaning-making, and active coping predict positive outcomes. Isolation, rumination, and passive response predict negative outcomes. Dostoevsky's emphasis on love and faith as context for redemptive suffering aligns with this research. Religious belief correlates with various psychological outcomes in complex ways. Believers report higher subjective well-being and life satisfaction on average. They cope better with stress, illness, and bereavement. But these benefits depend heavily on the type and quality of religious engagement. Intrinsic religiosity, faith held for its own sake, predicts better outcomes. Extrinsic religiosity, faith used for social advantage, predicts worse outcomes. Fundamentalist certainty correlates with rigidity and prejudice. Open, questioning faith correlates with tolerance and personal growth. Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as promoting weakness finds limited support. Religious people do not appear weaker or more passive than non-believers in general. Some forms of faith promote agency, resilience, and active engagement with life. The blanket condemnation of religion as slave morality oversimplifies the data. Neuroscience reveals that moral judgments involve emotion as much as reason. Damage to emotional processing regions impairs moral decision-making. We feel that something is wrong before we think through why. This supports Dostoevsky's view that morality is more than rational calculation. But neuroscience does not tell us whether these moral intuitions track truth. Evolution could have shaped intuitions that serve survival without corresponding to reality. The origins of moral feelings do not prove their validity or invalidity. Science describes the mechanisms, it cannot evaluate the metaphysics. Research on free will has complicated implications for both thinkers. Unconscious brain processes precede conscious decisions by measurable intervals. This suggests that conscious will may be less in control than we experience. Nietzsche anticipated this finding with his skepticism about the unified self. Yet behavior is clearly influenced by beliefs, values, and deliberate choices. People who believe in free will behave more responsibly than those who do not. The practical reality of choice remains even if the metaphysics are unclear. Both thinkers' emphasis on what we do with our freedom retains importance. Evolutionary accounts of religion present challenges for Dostoevsky's position. Religious belief may have evolved because it enhanced group cohesion and cooperation. This does not mean religious beliefs are true, only that they were useful. The naturalistic explanation seems to undermine the supernatural claims. Dostoevsky could respond that God might work through natural processes, including evolution. The evolutionary origin of religious capacity does not disprove religious truth. God could have designed humans to be capable of knowing Him. Science describes proximate mechanisms. Faith addresses ultimate purposes. The scientific evidence does not decisively resolve the debate between these worldviews. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche captured genuine aspects of human psychology. Neither was entirely right. Neither was entirely wrong. The choice between them remains a matter of interpretation, values, and perhaps faith. Part 16. Misconceptions and Scholarly Battles. Both Dostoevsky and Nietzsche have been persistently misunderstood and misappropriated. Correcting these distortions is necessary for genuine engagement with their thought. Scholarly debates continue over fundamental questions of interpretation. Understanding these controversies deepens appreciation of both thinkers' complexity. The Nazi appropriation of Nietzsche remains the most notorious misreading in philosophical history. Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive, and Nietzsche's concepts were weaponized for propaganda. The Übermensch became the master race. Will to power became military conquest. This interpretation was a grotesque distortion enabled by selective quotation and deliberate manipulation. Elisabeth Förster-Nietzsche, the philosopher's sister, bears significant responsibility. She edited his unpublished notes into The Will to Power, a book Nietzsche never wrote. She was a committed anti-Semite who shaped his legacy to match her ideology. Serious Nietzsche scholarship has spent decades undoing her damage. Nietzsche explicitly and repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism and German nationalism. He broke with Richard Wagner, partly over Wagner's anti-Semitism. He called anti-Semites contemptible and mocked German claims to superiority. His praise for Jewish contributions to European culture contradicts Nazi ideology entirely. The Übermensch is not a racial concept, but an individual achievement of self-overcoming. It has nothing to do with biological breeding or ethnic superiority. Nietzsche admired great individuals regardless of their national origin. Napoleon, Goethe, and Caesar were his examples, not blonde Germanic warriors. Will to power does not mean domination over others, but self-mastery and creative expression. The highest form of power is power over oneself, not power over external victims. Conquest and violence represent crude, lower forms of will to power. The philosopher and artist rank higher than the tyrant in Nietzsche's hierarchy. Dostoevsky has also been subject to significant misreadings and appropriations. Soviet critics attempted to claim him as a proto-revolutionary despite his explicit conservatism. They emphasized his sympathy for the poor while ignoring his Christian Orthodox faith. This selective reading produced a sanitized, ideologically acceptable Dostoevsky. Conversely, some religious readers have reduced Dostoevsky to simple Christian apologetics. They ignore the power of his atheist characters and the genuine questions they raise. Even Karamazov's rebellion is not a strawman, but a formidable intellectual challenge. Dostoevsky took atheism seriously, which is why his faith carries such weight. The relationship between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche has generated extensive scholarly debate. Did Nietzsche understand Dostoevsky correctly, or did he fundamentally misread him? Did Dostoevsky anticipate and refute Nietzsche, or are they more similar than different? Scholars remain divided on these questions without clear resolution. Lev Shestov argued that Dostoevsky secretly shared Nietzsche's conclusions but lacked courage. The Christian endings of his novels were compromises with convention. Underground, Dostoevsky believed in will to power and the bankruptcy of morality. Shestov saw both thinkers as philosophers of tragedy confronting meaningless existence. This reading has been influential but remains controversial. It requires treating Dostoevsky's explicit religious convictions as insincere or self-deceptive. The evidence from his letters and notebooks supports genuine, if struggling, faith. Shestov may have projected his own philosophical conclusions onto Dostoevsky. Georg Brandes interpreted Dostoevsky through Nietzschean categories from the beginning. He saw the underground man as exemplifying ressentiment and slave morality. This interpretation shaped how European intellectuals received Dostoevsky for generations. But it may have imposed an alien framework that distorts the original meaning. Russian scholars often emphasize aspects of Dostoevsky that Western readers minimize. His Russian Orthodox spirituality is central, not incidental, to his work. His Slavophile nationalism influences his vision in ways Westerners find uncomfortable. The cosmopolitan Dostoevsky familiar to Western readers is a partial construction. The question of whether Dostoevsky could have read Nietzsche is historically settled. Dostoevsky died in 1881, before Nietzsche became widely known. His philosophical influences were Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Russian thinkers. Any apparent anticipation of Nietzsche results from convergent response to shared problems. Mikhail Bakhtin's interpretation of Dostoevsky as a polyphonic novelist complicates both misreadings. Dostoevsky does not simply advocate positions through his characters. His novels are dialogues where multiple voices have genuine independent force. Ivan and Zosima both speak with authorial power, even when they contradict each other. This polyphonic reading suggests that Dostoevsky was exploring rather than preaching. The novels stage philosophical conflicts without necessarily resolving them. Readers who extract simple messages miss the dialogical complexity. Dostoevsky lived in the questions more than in the answers. Contemporary scholarship continues to generate new interpretations and debates. Postmodern readings emphasize the instability and undecidability of both thinkers' texts. Political readings connect their ideas to contemporary struggles over liberalism and authority. Neither Dostoevsky nor Nietzsche has become a settled, completed figure. Part 17. The Choice That Remains. After traversing this philosophical landscape, we return to the fundamental question. What does human existence require, and how should we respond to its demands? Dostoevsky and Nietzsche offered incompatible answers that cannot both be entirely true. Yet both captured something real about the human condition that demands response. Nietzsche diagnosed the death of God and proposed self-overcoming as the path forward. Create your own values. Become who you are through struggle and affirmation. Amor Fati transforms suffering into the necessary condition for greatness. The Übermensch emerges as the highest possibility of human achievement. This path demands tremendous strength, honesty, and courage. One must face existence without the comfort of transcendent meaning. There is no God to guarantee that your efforts matter or your suffering is redeemed. You are alone in a universe that neither loves nor hates you. The appeal of Nietzsche's vision lies in its heroic self-reliance. You need no permission, no external validation, no cosmic approval. Your life is your own creation, for which you bear full responsibility. This is terrifying, but also liberating for those strong enough to embrace it. The danger of this path is isolation, despair, and the cruelty that can follow. Without transcendent constraints, what prevents will to power from becoming domination? Nietzsche trusted that the truly great would be generous, but history provides counterexamples. Not everyone who believes themselves an Übermensch actually achieves nobility. Dostoevsky diagnosed the same crisis but proposed faith, love, and suffering as the path forward. Return to Christ. Discover your true self through repentance and grace. Suffering is not merely obstacle, but the crucible in which redemption is forged. Love of others, even enemies, reflects and participates in divine love. This path demands humility, trust, and surrender of autonomous control. One must accept that human reason cannot solve the deepest problems of existence. There is a God whose purposes exceed human understanding, but whose love is certain. You are not alone. You are held by a reality greater than yourself. The appeal of Dostoevsky's vision lies in its promise of connection and ultimate meaning. Suffering makes sense within a cosmic story of fall and redemption. Love is not strategy, but participation in the ground of being itself. Death is not the end, but a transition to fuller life. The danger of this path is self-deception, passivity, and the cruelty done in God's name. Faith can become a cover for weakness, conformity, and avoidance of responsibility. Not everyone who claims Christianity actually lives its demands. The Grand Inquisitor shows how faith can be corrupted into its opposite. Neither path eliminates the risk of failure and self-deception. Nietzsche's followers can become petty tyrants convinced of their own greatness. Dostoevsky's followers can become smug believers judging others' sins while ignoring their own. The dangers are different, but equally real. Perhaps the choice between these visions cannot be made on purely rational grounds. Both are internally consistent responses to the human condition. Evidence and argument alone do not compel one answer over the other. At some point, one must decide what kind of person one will become. Nietzsche would say, "Create yourself with honesty and courage. Do not hide behind inherited beliefs or conventional morality. Face the void and respond with affirmation, not whimpering retreat. Your life is the only meaning that exists. Make it worthy of eternity." Dostoevsky would say, "You cannot create yourself because you did not create existence. Humble yourself before the mystery that exceeds your comprehension. Love others as Christ loved, even unto death. Your life is a gift to be received with gratitude and offered back in service." Both would agree that the worst response is comfortable mediocrity. The last men who have invented happiness represent spiritual death. Better to struggle with God like Jacob than to settle for mere contentment. Better to wrestle with meaninglessness than to pretend the question does not matter. The conversation between Dostoevsky and Nietzsche is not a debate to be won. It is a dialogue that illuminates the fundamental choices of human existence. Each thinker saw something true that the other missed or denied. Full wisdom may require holding both perspectives in tension. We live in a time when both paths remain open and both dangers remain real. Secular modernity has not produced the flourishing its prophets promised. Religious revival has not restored the coherence of pre-modern faith. We remain suspended between worlds, searching for ground to stand upon. Each person must navigate this terrain with whatever resources they possess. There are no guaranteed outcomes, no formulas that work for everyone. The examined life requires confronting these questions, not evading them. Dostoevsky and Nietzsche remain essential guides for those willing to take the journey. Their disagreement is finally about what humans are and what we might become. Are we creatures designed for communion with the divine, fallen but redeemable? Or are we self-creating beings whose highest achievement is autonomous self-overcoming? The answer shapes everything else: how we live, love, suffer, and die. The conversation continues because the question remains open. Every generation must confront it anew with the resources available. Neither thinker provided final answers, only profound ways of asking the questions. That may be the most any thinker can offer to those who come after.